A listener warning before we start. This story features discussion of suicide. Please be advised. Fred Fleet is about to start his night shift. The 24-year-old makes his way towards the Crow's Nest, where he'll be spending the next few hours scanning the surface of the dark waters with fellow lookout Reginald Lee. This spring night, it's very cold and clear. Fleet observes how the stars look like lanterns above him. But Fleet won't be watching the stars. He'll be looking ahead at the uninterrupted view of the vast black North Atlantic Ocean. Because Fred Fleet's job as lookout means serving as the eyes of the ship. He's got to keep a keen watch for any obstacles ahead, and if he spots something, he's got to alert the bridge or control centre as quickly as possible. This night shift is gruelling, but it's a good gig for Fleet. Because this vessel is something else. Billed as the largest, most luxurious passenger ship in the world, it's carrying more than 2,000 people from Britain to America. In fact, it's already been making headlines for its audacious size and engineering. They call it unsinkable. It's 10 p.m. on the 14th of April 1912 in the North Atlantic Ocean. Fred Fleet begins to climb the ladder to the Crow's Nest. No one on board can begin to imagine the catastrophe that will unfold an hour and 40 minutes later. The Titanic sails on into the yawning darkness ahead. Hello and welcome to Beastly History with me, Michelle Douglas. This is the show where we investigate thrilling tales of people and the wild. And brace yourself for a truly epic topic today. It's Iceberg right ahead, the story of Titanic lookout Fred Fleet. Maybe it's from the history books, or you're a fan of the classic 1997 movie. The chances are you know something about the Titanic, one of history's most infamous disasters. It's just turned 114 years since RMS Titanic hit an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic Ocean. The Titanic is an enormous story, so we're going to be focusing on the point of view of one person in particular, Fred Fleet, the lookout who uttered the famous words, "Iceberg right ahead." And we'll be joined by Titanic expert Paul Lee to revisit that spring night in 1912 to help us explore Fred Fleet's story. And we'll investigate questions like, why did the Titanic sail full speed into a lethal ice field? Were the lookouts unfairly blamed? And what does the disaster teach us about when, in pursuit of progress, we ignore the power of nature? Paul, thank you so much for coming on to Beastly History. What is it for you about the Titanic do you think has interested you all these years later?
Well, people always ask me, why am I interested in the Titanic? And I always say, if I knew what it was, I'd bottle and sell it. I'd make a fortune. It has maintained a momentum in my life and that I can't explain. I don't know why it is. And I try and keep interested in many different facets of the disaster, but there's so much yet to research. But it's also tempered by the fact that there's a lot that is unknowable because, let's face it, 2/3 of the people on the ship perished. So there are going to be stories that we will never know about.
So I'm almost a bit nervous to say this, Paul, but in the film, I think a lot of people will remember Fred Fleet because in the film, the 1997 Titanic, he's the first person to see the iceberg. Who is Fred Fleet? How would most people know him?
Well, people would know him from being the lookout man who warned the bridge of the iceberg. He was working with a colleague called Reginald Lee. And I think they both saw the iceberg at about the same time, but Fleet is remembered as the one who rang the warning bell and telephoned the bridge. Frederick
Fleet had an eventful life. He was born in 1887 in Liverpool in the UK into poverty and hardship. Fleet grew up without his parents. He didn't know his father and he was also abandoned by his mother, who went to live in the US, leaving him behind. Fleet was moved around children's homes and distant relatives. He had little opportunity for stability or education, and aged around 12, he started working at sea. Fleet works his way up from deck boy to able seaman. That's someone who's recognised as experienced and knowledgeable and can work lots of different jobs aboard a ship. And then, in his 20s, Fleet gets lucky. He finds work in a new class of ship, luxury ocean liners. Fleet secures a job on the RMS Oceanic, a transatlantic passenger ship built by the company White Star Line. Once aboard, he can earn a few extra shillings a month by taking on lookout duties. So when, a few years later, Fred Fleet's offered work aboard another White Star Line ship, the Titanic, he readily accepts. What would his job as a lookout have involved?
Well, he stood 2-hour watches with his mate Reginald Lee, and he was on the 10 p.m. to midnight watch. So what would happen is the lookouts would do 2 hours in the crow's nest, 4 hours off, then 2 hours on, mixed would repeat in cycles. And their job was quite simple, just to scan the horizon for any obstructions. And then if they saw it, report to the bridge. So that was basically their job. But when they weren't in the crow's nest and they weren't resting, they probably did other seamen's tasks, like assisting the officers and maybe even swabbing the decks. So their main job was as a lookout. And I think they were paid an extra allowance a month to do the lookout.
It's quite a brutal shift, that, isn't it? Overnight, standing in the freezing cold. And of course, you have to really concentrate. So it's quite a tough job in a way.
What most people don't realise is they must have been encountering a ferocious wind chill on their faces in this job. The temperature of the air was about -2 degrees, I think, 2 degrees Celsius. Imagine having a wind chill like that biting into your face and your eyes. I don't know how they did it. So I've got some admiration for them for doing it.
Absolutely. What do you think the staff culture was like?
Although you get the very, very strong impression that the senior officers didn't really tend to mix except with other passengers because that was part of their job, part of their remit. The other staff members, like the stewards, for instance, they did have a camaraderie between themselves and a good working relationship, and friendships were nurtured, and they looked out for their mates as well. So there wasn't much isolationism on board the Titanic. If you were involved in one department, restaurant or dining room staff or bedroom stewards, you tended to have a fixed group of companions which you would look out for. So I would say on the whole, the ship was quite friendly.
10th of April 1912. The Titanic sets off from Southampton in the UK. There's excitement for every ticket holder, and the crew and hundreds of people have gathered on the docks to glimpse the great ship set off on its maiden voyage to New York in America. The 2,200 passengers and crew aboard represent a spread of Edwardian society, from migrants hoping to scrape their way out of poverty in a new land, to families wanting to start a new life of opportunity for their kids, to millionaire business owners, early movie stars seeking their fortunes, and everyone in between. The White Star Line company, who owns the Titanic, has been enjoying presenting the ship on the world stage, and the reaction in the press over its size, luxury, and engineering. It really is befitting of the great British Edwardian era of travel. And that seems important for a country trying to deny the signs its global powers are fading. The journey is expected to take about a week to cover the nearly 3,000 miles or 4,500 kilometres across the North Atlantic Ocean.
We left Southampton just after 12 on April the 10th. It had brief stopovers in Cherbourg and then the next day in Queenstown in Ireland. But certainly from early afternoon on April the 11th till 11:40 p.m. on the 14th, that was an uninterrupted, quite mundane journey, quite nondescript. So for 3 days, everything, 3.5 days, just about. Everything was fine. And then disaster struck.
Contemporaries and historians in the more than 110 years since the disaster have pored over every detail of what went wrong on the Titanic's doomed maiden voyage. Before the ship even got anywhere near the ice fields, there were multiple factors that would compound what would happen next. Like, there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. The belief that the ship was practically unsinkable may have led to complacent attitudes, and weaknesses in the building material would mean the ship was unable to cope when the collision came. Out on the North Atlantic Ocean, able-bodied seaman and lookout Fred Fleet has little idea of the dangers ahead. Fleet doesn't know the environment is shifting to create vast areas filled with icebergs of all kinds of sizes. What's the environment like out in the Atlantic ice fields that the Titanic would unknowingly be passing through?
Well, in April 1912, there had been many, many reports of multiple icebergs, and they tend to be congregating right on the Titanic's path. And that is the confluence of the Labrador Current, which is a slower southerly current, very cold, from the Arctic regions. And that's where it met with the Gulf Stream, which is a faster, warmer current heading northeast. The Titanic was heading right for this region, and the icebergs were drifting right into its path. The ice field that the Titanic almost reached was maybe about 50, 60 miles long. We're not entirely sure. On the eastern edge of the ice field where the Titanic met her fate was just studded with hundreds and hundreds of icebergs. And on April the 14th, as the day proceeded, people noticed it was getting very, very cold. And this was to some people's consternation, because the heating system on the Titanic wasn't exactly functioning very well. So people were going into public rooms wearing coats and furs to keep warm. And not many people were happy about this, but it was a brand new ship. There were bound to be teething problems. Some people also described the smell of ice in the air. One first-class passenger who, before she went to bed, she said she smelt a cold, clammy odour, which she'd smelt before in a cave on her holidays. So, yeah, very, very cold. Lots of ice reports.
Astonishingly, the Titanic receives multiple warnings about the ice. So, what happened? Did the ship properly digest and understand the ice warnings? Why did they sail straight into disaster that other ships had managed to avoid?
There was sort of a cavalier attitude towards the handling of ice reports. They received a lot of ice reports on April the 14th. Not many reached the bridge. They just seemed to have disappeared into the ether. Very few of them were seen by officers, and we don't know what became of them. And even fewer were marked on the navigation charts in the chart room behind the wheelhouse. The penultimate ice report that the Titanic received was from a ship called the Mesaba. And they had encountered a very, very large ice field and icebergs. And they radioed the Titanic, and they'd given a series of coordinates. They later called it the fatal oblong, or the fatal rectangle. Now, as it turned out, at the moment the Titanic received that ice warning, the Titanic had just about steamed into that ice rectangle. And the operator on the Mesaba sent this message. Phillips, the senior operator on the Titanic, sent a polite message back saying, "Received, thanks." And the Mesaba's operator waited for ages for a official notification from the captain, but none came. And in the end, he just gave up and eventually went to sleep. So what happened to that last vital message, which was received about an hour and a half or 2 hours before the collision? We don't know what happened to it. If it had gone to the bridge, who knows what might have happened? But it just seemed to have vanished into the air, like most of the other ice warnings. So there seems to be a cavalier attitude. They just didn't seem to attach much import to them.
Which calls into question the other element, which is the speed. Was it going too fast?
You would have thought so. The Titanic was traveling at 22.5 knots, or nearly 25.9 miles per hour. And you would have thought with all the ice warnings, they would have slowed down. Numerous captains were called at the British inquiry, and without fail, they all said Their operating procedure was to travel at full speed until danger was seen. And to this day, people find that incredible. The common sense attitude these days is if you're into ice areas, you slow down. And Ernest Shackleton, the Arctic explorer, said you have no right going that fast in an ice region. And he thought that the public pressure for speed forced the issue.
It's 11 p.m. Fred Fleet has taken up his position in the Titanic crow's nest alongside his fellow lookout, Reginald Lee. The pair have been briefed to look out for small ice known as growlers. The night is very cold. In the clear sky, the stars shine brightly. The visibility is good. The water is eerily calm though. That will mean there are fewer waves to break against objects for the lookouts to see. And there's something else Fred Fleet isn't happy about. In his previous job on the Oceanic, Fleet had had binoculars on every shift. He liked using them. He had a habit of switching between binoculars and the naked eye to look out for obstacles on his watch. But there are no binoculars for him on the Titanic. In fact, they seem to have been missing for the whole trip. He's asked for them before, but now he's given up. That will come back to haunt the Titanic crew. One of the big questions about one of the things that went wrong in the Titanic was the binoculars. Could you tell us what happened?
The lookouts didn't have binoculars. That's the basic, simple part of the story. But what happened to them is quite fascinating. They did have binoculars from the delivery trip from Belfast to Southampton. And these seemed to belong to the then second officer, David Blair. And then when they reached Southampton, one of the lookouts was told to lock the binoculars away in the second officer's cabin. After all, they weren't needed in port. And then there was a bit of a reshuffle of the hierarchy of the senior officers in Southampton. Basically, what happened was Henry Wilde was brought on board as the chief officer, and that meant that David Blair was asked to stand down from the trip. This happened at the very, very last minute. So David Blair packed up his stuff, left the ship, and in that confusion, the binoculars were overlooked. Now, there were binoculars on board the ship, but they were used by the officers on the bridge. The lookouts did ask quite a few times for binoculars, or glasses as they're called in the terminology in those days. And each time they were told there were none for you or get them later or whatever. So they were given the brush off. And the lookouts talked about it amongst themselves and they were very, very disappointed by this.
Perhaps surprisingly, some ships used binoculars while others deliberately did not. Whether or not having binoculars would have made those crucial seconds of difference on the Titanic divides experts like Paul Lee, who, by the way, comes down on the side of thinking binoculars would have had little effect when the iceberg came into view.
Binoculars seem to be mainly used for sighting things on the horizon and identifying them. But the iceberg that was seen was so close to the Titanic, we're talking maybe 500 or 600 yards ahead when it was first seen, that binoculars would have made absolutely no difference at all. And in fact, they might even have been a hindrance, because if you'd seen something like that and lifted the binoculars to your eyes to identify it, in those few seconds, that might have been the difference between hitting the iceberg and avoiding it completely. And that was later brought up at the inquiries. Second Officer Lightoller has said that, unlike other captains, he upheld the use of binoculars in the crow's nest, but he didn't want lookouts to become transfixed in their usage. What he wanted was for lookouts to see something, report it. By warning the bridge, they then can make the identification. That should not be left to the lookouts. Viewing the object, phoning through to the bridge. Literally, and this is no cliche, every second counts.
It's 11:40 p.m. Fred Fleet is looking out at the great, yawning blackness ahead of him, when suddenly he sees something. To him, it at first looks small, but the obstacle is in fact huge. Fleet thinks he knows what it is. "There's ice ahead," he says to fellow lookout Reginald Lee. The Titanic is heading straight for a huge iceberg at full speed. The great ship has less than a minute before it smashes straight into hard ice. Horrified, Fleet springs into action in the crow's nest. Every second counts. He rings the warning bell hard 3 times and snatches at the telephone to the bridge.
Is anyone there?
6th Officer Moody, who's picked up, says, "Yes, what did you see?" And Fleet utters the warning.
Iceberg, right ahead.
"Thank you," says Moody. The Titanic has about 40 seconds to turn before it hits. On the bridge, Moody reports the warning to 1st Officer Murdoch, who gives the order, hard a starboard, to turn the head of the ship away from the iceberg. Murdoch goes to the engine room telegraph to order the ship to stop. Up on the crow's nest, lookouts Fred Fleet and Reginald Lee have turned back to their view of the looming iceberg, wishing with every inch for the great ship to miss. Fleet notices the Titanic has begun to turn. 20 seconds. The ship's nose is turning away. 10 seconds. Might they just clear the disaster? 5 seconds. The ship hasn't done enough to miss the iceberg. Too late. The side of the ship scrapes alongside the great hulk of ice. From the crow's nest, the lookouts only see some chunks of ice fall onto the deck, and they hear a peculiar, soft, grinding noise. Fred Fleet thinks that was a narrow shave.
It's tragic as well that actually disaster had struck for Fred Fleet to say, "Oh, that was a close shave." Just goes to show, doesn't it, the kind of damage that an iceberg can do, and actually at its ground, that huge kind of strike along the side of it, which they couldn't recover from.
7/8 of the iceberg is below water. So if you see 60 feet of it, there's 420 feet that you don't see. And you don't know how far that extends out to around the ship, because you just don't know what is below the waterline. But a lot of the crew on board the ship were seduced by this myth of the Titanic's unsinkability. And even those who had seen water cascading into the ship still did not think that it would sink. They thought the ship was invincible. So for Fleet and Lee to think that it was a close shave and nothing important, or they were just going to pump the water out and repair the damage and they'll be on their way in a few hours, which is what some people thought, that was an almost universal mindset aboard the ship. The only people who really seemed to know about it were some of the senior officers who were briefed. One of the designers of the Titanic, Thomas Andrews from Belfast, was on the ship, and he did some calculations, and he also did some soundings of the water level, and he realised the ship would not survive. But probably to prevent a panic occurring, this wasn't widely known amongst many people on the ship. I'd say even amongst those who had seen water inside the hull, they thought the ship would be repaired and on her way soon.
The Titanic has struck a massive iceberg. It was not a narrow shave as Fleet had hoped. Over the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, the unsinkable ship will disappear into the depths of the icy and deadly North Atlantic Ocean. It's chaos aboard the ship. It's filling with freezing water. There aren't enough lifeboats for everyone, but some take off hardly filled. Families are torn apart. Many men are left on the sinking ship while it's women and children first. And the passenger classes are treated very differently. First class receives assistance, while the third class are well below deck and receive poor communication and help. The human cost will be terrible. More than 1,500 people will die, around 2/3 of those aboard, mainly from hypothermia or drowning as they're sucked into the icy seas. And Britain's attempt to impress the world with the biggest and best unsinkable ship to dominate the seas ends in inconceivable catastrophe. One of those watching the sinking from a lifeboat is lookout Fred Fleet, one of the around 700 survivors of the Titanic.
For people who might be wondering about the male crew members on the lifeboats, how did Fred Fleet manage to survive?
On the starboard side of the ship with Murdoch in command, it was basically just take anyone who was there. And if that meant you got a lot of stewards or stokers on board the ship, then fine. He just took whoever was right there. So more male crewmen probably survived on the starboard side of the ship than the port side of the ship. Fred Fleet survived simply because after he finished his duty shift, he went down to his quarters, again, not thinking there was anything wrong, and a crewman said, "You're needed on the bridge." So he and Lee went up there and saw that they were unfurling the lifeboats, and he went straight to boat 6 and helped to ready it. So when it got time to be lowered, he was already there.
Fred Fleet and those aboard Lifeboat 6 are finally picked up by a passing ship, the Carpathia. It's been a night that will haunt Fleet and many others for the rest of their lives. The sinking of the Titanic is met with shock and disbelief. How could this possibly have happened? The public demand for answers is immediate, and inquests are quickly held to try to understand what happened and why. Some of the surviving crew are among those to take the stand, and Fred Fleet is robustly questioned about the lookout's part in the disaster.
The lookouts already had a massive public indignation levelled at them, and there were some have said the whole disaster could be blamed on, quote, the poor lookouts, unquote. So there was a lot of blame placed at them. Some of it justifiable, maybe, and some of it not. It's been pointed out that at the US inquiry, the chairman of the White Star Line, Ismay, sat in on most, if not all, of the interrogations, even when he wasn't being asked questions. And you can imagine this poor lookout man who thought he was going to be blamed for the disaster, and he had the eyes of the chairman blazing at him at all times. You think you can imagine what that would be like. I don't know if he was terrified at the thought of being blamed for the loss of the ship at the 2 inquiries. He comes across as being a bit defensive at times, but he comes across as a very humble man.
What happened to Fred Fleet after the Titanic and the following inquests into the disaster? Like I said at the start, Fred Fleet lived an eventful life. After the Titanic, Fleet continued to work as a seaman. Although we can't verify it, some people have suggested Fleet was seen as a bad luck omen by superstitious sailors in some of his jobs after the Titanic, but nonetheless, he worked for the next 2 decades at sea. As a man who happened to be born at the end of the 19th century, Fleet found himself witness some major traumatic events of the early 20th century. He served in both World War I and World War II and survived both. In his domestic life, Fleet married a woman called Eva from the Channel Islands and had a daughter, Dorothy. He seems to have been a devoted family man. In his older age, Fleet took odd jobs, including selling the Southampton Echo newspaper. It's likely his customers had no idea the man they were buying their paper from held such a place in British history. But Fleet struggled throughout his life with poverty and mental health. He had few friends, although he did keep closely in touch with the Titanic Historical Society, and as a product of his era, he kept himself to himself.
Fleet also seemed to suffer from blackouts and was taking medication. And he said that his sleep was affected. He was having nightmares about this black mass approaching, which was obviously the iceberg. And the doctor put him on pills to help. By 1964, Fleet and his wife had separated and were living in separate rooms at his wife's brother's apartment. Despite the separation, she was still legally responsible for him. Her health deteriorated in 1964, and Fred was very, very disconsolate. And he thought that his own end was near. and he was absolutely distraught when his wife died. Fred did not get on with his brother-in-law, and they agreed that when his wife died, he was to move out. He was to find his own lodgings. Fleet had tried to find accommodation but was unsuccessful, and he spent most of his time roaming the bush shelters.
Tragically, on January the 9th, 1965, aged 77, Fred Fleet took his own life. Shortly after, he was buried in a cemetery in his hometown, Southampton.
He was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave, and for many years his grave was unknown. But in 1993, thanks to donations from the Titanic Historical Society, they put a grave marker on. And that was a very, very sad end for him.
Fred Fleet, an impoverished working man, was part of some of the biggest events of the 20th century. Much of history has been recorded by the dominant, privileged people of the day. Fred Fleet's story gives us a different perspective. Fleet was anything but ordinary. His story is extraordinary. We've explored how Fleet was at the sharp end of the Edwardian display of dominance over nature that ended in disaster. But the Titanic is an enormous story that continues to grip us, and we devour every angle, detail, and new finding.
Is there more for us to discover with the Titanic? We have been obsessed with the story for so long. Do you think there's anything more that we can learn from it?
It's difficult to say. What we occasionally do find is through newspaper trawls, forgotten interviews, or letters that have surfaced, perhaps at auction, which might mention something. And that is where the trove of Titanic treasure has come from in the last few years, and where it will be found in the future, I think. So a lot of the Titanic story will be unknown and unknowable, probably.
Paulie, thank you so much for chatting to me. It's been intriguing and also spine-tingling.
We're ending our story on April the 15th, 1912, at daybreak. Dawn has broken over an unimaginable night. Things will not be the same again. Fred Fleet is aboard Lifeboat 6. It's only when the sun peaks above the horizon over the vast North Atlantic Ocean that Fleet looks around and finally understands what he could not in the darkness of the night before. They're surrounded by ice fields, stretching out as far as the eye can see. It's time for takeaways. I don't mind admitting that my real entry into the Titanic story was the 1997 James Cameron movie. I was 11 when it came out, and like loads of other fans, I went to see it more than once at the cinema. And I clearly remember Fred Fleet's scene in the lookout nest when he first sees the iceberg. And if you do have a chance to watch that scene again, I have to say I found it even more spine-tingling to see. I think for me, the main takeaway is I just feel so bad for Fred, being born at the time he was into really tough conditions, and how he ended up witnessing some really traumatic historical events in his life. But I'm so glad that we have his accounts of what happened to add so much colour and personality and different perspectives into the history books. He was at the sharp end of Edwardian posturing and an attempt for big companies like the White Star Line to dominate the seas, and a misguided belief people could somehow tame the ocean. Fred Fleet gives us such a human perspective on the Titanic as one of history's ultimate cautionary tales. Thanks for listening to this episode of Beastly History. The show's written and produced by me, Michelle Douglas. It's an independent production at Wild Beast Studios. Thank you so much for your lovely comments and reviews for the first few episodes. I've absolutely loved reading them, and please do keep them coming. New Beastly Histories drop every month, and in the meantime, you can follow me at Beastly History on Instagram. And if you want to learn more about Fred Fleet's story, I've added a link to his part in the Titanic inquests in the episode show notes. And a huge thanks to Paul Lee for his time and research for this episode too. Until next time, keep being beastly.